Welcome to today's deep dive. We have honestly, a remarkably heavy and provocative text on the table today.
Yeah, we really do.
And before we even look at the cover, I want to ask you a quick favor. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the show.
It really helps us out.
It does, and it ensures you never miss out when we explore these really complex cultural texts. So today, we are examining a 2025 ebook that is currently generating an immense amount of friction across the whole cultural landscape.
Friction is definitely the right word for it.
Right. And if you find our exploration today compelling, you should absolutely check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book for yourself. And make sure to follow the author at Conrad Riker over on Substack to see how his arguments are, evolving in real time.
Because they are definitely evolving. It's a text that forces the reader to confront some very uncomfortable cultural realities. And that's regardless of where you stand on the political spectrum.
Exactly. So the book is called Imago Dei, The Ultimate Identity for Men Beyond Marriage and Status by Conrad Riker. Now, we've tailored today's analysis specifically for you, the listener, who is trying to map out the shifting dynamics of modern gender roles.
Right. The landscape is changing fast.
It is. Maybe you're navigating the intricate discussions happening within the men's rights sphere, or perhaps you're tuning into red pill communities, or maybe you just possess an intense historical curiosity about our cultural institutions.
And specifically how they got to where they are now.
Yes, exactly. Because according to Riker's core thesis, these institutions were systematically captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies over the last few decades. We're going to decode all of that today.
But before we jump in, because this text dives right into the heart of the modern culture wars, we really need to set the parameters for our discussion today.
Yeah, that's crucial.
Riker's book contains highly politically charged content. He presents aggressive, very specific viewpoints regarding feminism, institutional capture, and the state of modern masculinity.
Right. And to be crystal clear with you, we are not here to endorse Riker's politics, nor are we taking a side in this broader cultural conflict.
No, not at all.
Think of us as your impartial scouts. Our job is simply to map out the territory of his arguments, break down the historical and statistical claims he makes, and synthesize his core philosophy.
We just want you to understand the architecture of the arguments currently driving the manosphere.
Exactly. So you can evaluate the landscape with absolute clarity and draw your own conclusions.
Precisely. We're just interrogating the text. So to give you a roadmap of how we'll navigate this deep dive, we're going to start with Riker's diagnosis of the modern landscape, what he terms the crisis of modern masculinity.
And we'll scrutinize the statistical foundation of those claims.
Right. From there, we'll transition into his historical critique of how institutions function today, which he links to the concept of the Red Pill Awakening. Then we will thoroughly examine his proposed theological and philosophical solution, the concept of Imago Dei.
Which is fascinating.
It really is. And finally, we'll look at his practical blueprint for how men can build physical brotherhood and a lasting legacy.
All right, let's start at ground zero, the diagnosis. Riker opens the book by painting a rather bleak picture.
Very bleak.
He doesn't ease the reader in at all. He drops this foundational argument that men are currently operating in a state of severe, unprecedented crisis. And he introduces this phrase, zeroed out.
Zeroed out, yeah.
He describes a generation of men who are essentially treading water in a sea of contradictory expectations. On one hand, they feel this biological and historical drive to be providers and protectors.
Right, the traditional role.
But on the other hand, they exist in a modern culture that Riker argues actively penalizes those exact instincts.
He structures this whole argument around the idea of a vanishing script.
Unpack that a bit.
Well, historically, society provided a very clear, albeit rigid, script for manhood. You provide, you protect, you build. That was the deal.
Nope.
Riker posits that this script has been shredded. But the real problem is that nothing viable has replaced it. Men are told that their traditional value markers, like being the sole breadwinner, are outdated.
But then they're simultaneously discarded when they fail to meet those exact same traditional financial metrics.
Exactly. He argues this leaves men divorced, fired, culturally forgotten, and spiritually bankrupt.
And he doesn't just rely on the anecdotal feeling of male angst. He anchors this entire premise in some very stark data.
He does.
The one that immediately jumps off the page is his citation of the 2023 U.S. suicide rate. He points out that the rate was 3.88 times higher for men than for women.
That statistic it's really the emotional core of his early chapters.
It's a heavy number.
It is. And he refuses to let the reader view that number as just a tragic anomaly of mental health. Riker frames that 3.88 multiplier as a literal, societal-level scream for help. It is the terminal endpoint of being zeroed out. He argues that when a man is stripped of his innate purpose, and when society continuously signals that his natural behaviors are problematic, the resulting internal void becomes fatal.
And he actually traces a massive acceleration of this void back to a specific economic event, the 2008 financial crisis.
Yeah, the Great Recession.
Which is an interesting place to drop the pin. He argues that the Great Recession didn't just fracture the global economy, it fractured the modern male identity.
It's a fascinating economic and psychological correlation. Riker notes that during the 2008 crash, men lost their jobs at roughly twice the rate of women.
Because the sectors most heavily impacted, like manufacturing and construction, were male-dominated.
Exactly. But Riker's deeper point is about the psychological fallout of that. Because society had spent generations conditioning men to equate their total human worth with their economic output.
Their paycheck.
Right. Losing those jobs wasn't just a loss of income, it was an erasure of identity. If a man is only valuable because he provides, and the economy prevents him from providing,
He ceases to have value in his own eyes.
Exactly.
It makes sense historically, but Riker takes that thread and pulls it all the way back into childhood. He moves from the boardroom to the classroom.
right, to education.
He argues that the alienation starts long before a man ever enters the workforce. He pulls a 2021 report from the National Center for Education Statistics. And this report highlights that boys are 30% more likely to drop out of high school than girls.
A massive gap.
It is. And this is where I want to push on his argument a bit. Is he suggesting the education system is intentionally failing boys? Or just that it hasn't adapted to them?
Well, Riker leans heavily toward the former, or at least toward a systemic bias that borders on intentionality.
How so?
He argues that the modern classroom has been systematically redesigned over the last 50 years, designed to prioritize compliance, passivity, and quiet cooperation.
Sit still, raise your hand, don't speak out of turn.
Right. And these are traits that, generally speaking, align more easily with female developmental timelines in early childhood. Conversely, boys are biologically wired to be more physically restless, they're competitive, they're kinesthetic learners.
They need to move.
They do. Riker's assertion is that instead of accommodating that competitive energy, the modern education system medicates it, it punishes it, and it labors it as disruptive.
So the classroom becomes a hostile environment.
Exactly. In his view, it functions as a hostile environment that trains boys early on that their natural state is inherently wrong.
So if they're alienated in the classroom, where do they turn? They turn to culture, they turn to screens. And this brings us to his analysis of media representation, which is incredibly sharp.
It's one of the strongest parts of the book.
He looks at the evolution of the male archetype in popular culture. He contrasts the icons of the mid-20th century, the Clint Eastwoods, the John Waynes, the Indiana Joneses.
Classic leading men.
Right. These were figures defined by resourcefulness, stoicism, and an unapologetic protective strength.
And he contrasts them with the modern comedic and domestic archetypes. Riker specifically names characters like Homer Simpson or Phil Dunphy from Modern Family.
Right.
He characterizes them as bumbling fools and hen-picked husbands. The modern media landscape, he argues, frequently portrays the father figure as a lovable idiot, an idiot who needs to be constantly managed and corrected by his much smarter, more competent wife or children.
But is that really a systemic attack on masculinity? Or is it just lazy sitcom writing? Because the foolish dad trope has been around for a long time.
Riker actually anticipates that exact counter-argument. To prove it's not just lazy writing, but a pervasive cultural shift, he brings in a 2020 study by the Gina Davis Institute on Gender in Media.
And what did they find?
That study found that male characters are twice as likely to be depicted as aggressive, violent, or morally compromised compared to female characters.
Wow, twice as likely.
Yeah. Riker uses this data to demonstrate that the media is essentially boxing men into two acceptable narratives. You are either an incompetent joke to be laughed at, or you are a dangerous threat to be neutralized.
The joke or the threat. There is no representation of the noble protector anymore. And that specific dichotomy really came to a head in the cultural flashpoint he spends an entire chapter analyzing.
The Gillette ad.
The 2019 Gillette ad, famously titled The Best Men Can Be.
Yes, that ad serves as a vital case study in the book. For context, the ad essentially played as a short film addressing bullying, sexual harassment, and the broader concept of toxic masculinity. It urged men to hold each other accountable and do better.
Now, Riker despises this ad.
He absolutely tears it apart.
He views it as a corporate sermon that fundamentally condescends to its own demographic. He argues it painted men with a broad brush of inherent guilt. But here's where I want to examine his logic carefully.
Okay.
He points out that the backlash was massive. And he highlights that Gillette's parent company, Procter & Gamble, wrote down an $8 billion loss in value for the Gillette brand shortly after.
That's a massive hit.
Huge! And Riker presents this as a direct consequence of the ad, a massive financial penalty for insulting men. But isn't he risking a massive oversimplification there?
How do you mean?
Well, market dynamics are incredibly complex. Was an $8 billion write-down truly just about a 2-minute commercial? Or is he using Gillette as a convenient scapegoat for the rise of subscription shave clubs like Dollar Shave Club and Harry's?
That is an excellent critical question, and it's one a discerning reader must ask. Rucker does acknowledge the shifting market dynamics of the grooming industry, but he argues that the timing and the brand damage are inextricably linked to the cultural messaging.
So he's not ignoring the competition.
No. His thesis isn't necessarily that the ad alone bankrupted the brand's quarter. Rather, he argues the ad severely damaged the brand's emotional equity with its core consumers at the exact moment they had cheaper alternatives.
Ah, I see.
He used the Gillette fallout to prove a psychological point. Men are exhausted from being told they are inherently defective. When a brand that historically championed masculinity suddenly pivoted to treating masculinity as a disease in need of a cure, men simply walked away.
And that feeling of being viewed as a disease ties perfectly into what I found to be his most compelling psychological concept, the double bind.
Yes, the double bind is crucial.
This is the invisible trap he claims modern men are caught in.
The double bind is really the crux of the crisis. Riker defines it as a state of no-win psychological warfare.
Walk us through how that works.
Well, if a man acts in accordance with his traditional nature, if he is highly assertive, competitive, and fiercely protective, modern society quickly labels him as aggressive, domineering, or toxic. He is penalized for his strength.
But the trap closes on the other side too, because society simultaneously tells men to open up, be vulnerable, and dismantle their stoicism.
Exactly.
Yet, Riker argues the moment a man actually does that, the moment he exhibits weakness, overwhelming emotion, or passivity, he is quietly, or sometimes loudly, ridiculed.
He loses the respect of his peers. And quite often, according to Riker's view of intersexual dynamics, the attraction of his partner.
So society demands be a vulnerable modern man, but harshly punishes the reality of male vulnerability.
He is shamed for his strength and mocked for his weakness. Riker suggests this double bind creates a profound paralysis. It generates a generation of men walking a tightrope without a net, constantly second-guessing their own nature, resulting in the exact anxiety and depression statistics we discussed earlier.
This exact psychological trap, this profound sense that the rules of the game have been rigged against them, is what Riker points to as the catalyst for men seeking alternative answers.
They realize the mainstream script is a dead end.
They do, and that realization bridges us seamlessly into the next phase of his argument, the red pill awakening and his theory of institutional capture.
Now, when Riker talks about taking the red pill, he elevates it far beyond its origins in internet subcultures.
He's not just talking about dating forums here.
No, not at all. He frames it as a brutal, necessary epistemological shift. It is the conscious, active rejection of the sanitized, compliant version of reality that mainstream institutions promote. For Riker, the red pill is not about acquiring a new set of dating tactics. It is about recognizing that the dismantling of traditional masculinity is not an accident of history, but a feature of a newly designed system.
And he goes to great lengths to provide a historical blueprint for how this happened. He points the finger directly at a concept that gets debated heavily today: cultural Marxism.
Right.
Riker traces this back to the counterculture movements of the 1960s. His assertion is that traditional Marxism failed to incite a class war in the prosperous West, so its proponents adapted. They shifted the battlefield from economics to culture.
Exactly. Riker argues that instead of dividing the world into the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, cultural Marxism divides the world into the oppressors and the oppressed based on identity.
Race, gender, sexual orientation.
Yes, and he details how this ideology systematically infiltrated the critical sense-making institutions of society: the universities, the media, the entertainment industry, and eventually corporate HR departments.
But why target masculinity specifically? Why is the traditional man the enemy in this framework?
Because, according to Riker, Strong, independent, family-oriented men are the ultimate bulwark against state dependency and ideological conformity.
They don't need the state.
Exactly. A man who is fiercely protective of his family and self-reliant does not easily submit to sweeping institutional control. Therefore, to reshape society, the ideology must first pathologize and dismantle the traditional patriarch. Strong men, in his words, are a direct threat to the agenda of cultural homogenization.
And he sees modern feminism as the primary vehicle for this dismantling, but he makes a sharp distinction here. He doesn't critique first wave feminism, which sought basic legal equality and voting rights.
No, he's very clear on that.
He targets the modern iteration, describing it not as a movement for equality, but as a movement of inversion.
Inversion is a critical term for him. He argues that modern feminist narratives do not seek to elevate women alongside men. They seek to elevate women specifically by diminishing men.
It's a zero-sum game, in his view.
Totally. He points to the pervasive cultural messaging that teaches young girls they are inherently powerful and flawless, while simultaneously teaching young boys that they need to deconstruct their innate behaviors and apologize for historical grievances they had no part in.
He actually calls the phrase toxic masculinity a deliberate linguistic trap. I thought this was a brilliant piece of analysis.
It's very well argued.
He argues that by pairing the word toxic directly with the word masculinity as a cultural catchphrase, the implication over time becomes that masculinity itself is the poison. It conflates the abuse of power with the capacity for power.
He uses that great fire analogy.
Yes. He says it's like calling a fire toxic warmth. Fire can burn your house down if left unchecked, but it also heats your home and cooks your food. By defining the masculine drive to conquer and compete as a disease, society convinces men to voluntarily neuter their greatest strengths.
And because nature abhors a vacuum, this institutional suppression has birthed an enormous counterculture, the manosphere.
Right. When the mainstream fails, people look elsewhere.
Exactly. When the universities, the media, and the corporate world fail to provide a viable path for young men, and in fact treat them with hostility, those men migrate online to find mentors.
Riker views the manosphere as a direct symptom of the crisis, a massive digital ecosystem of blogs, forums, and influencers dedicated to decoding the modern female psyche and redefining male success.
And he specifically highlights figures who have dominated this space, like Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate, because they speak directly to the pain and confusion of the double bind.
However, Riker's analysis of the manosphere is highly nuanced and frequently critical. He does not view it as a monolith, nor does he view it as the ultimate solution.
He sees it as a chaotic triage center.
That's a great way to put it. For instance, he dissects the vast difference between Peterson and Tate. He praises Jordan Peterson for his rigorous emphasis on personal responsibility, psychological integration, and finding meaning through adopting heavy burdens.
Peterson offers a highly rational, almost classical approach to self-mastery.
But when it comes to Andrew Tate, Riker is far more cautious. While he acknowledges that Tate's exclusive popularity proves how desperately young men crave unapologetic masculinity, Riker criticizes Tate's brand of hypermasculinity as essentially a mirror image of modern materialism.
Right. If society tells you that your worth is external, Tate often reinforces that by measuring a man's worth in Bugattis, wealth, and sheer dominance.
Riker argues that simply replacing a feminist matrix with a hyper-consumerist, purely dominant matrix doesn't actually free a man, it just puts him in a different cage.
Precisely. Riker argues the manosphere is a symptom of a sick society, offering a cacophony of conflicting advice. However, he does advocate for selective self-education within it.
Like reading Rollo Tomassi.
Yes, he explicitly recommends that men read Rollo Tomassi's foundational book, The Rational Male. Riker believes Tomassi is essential for stripping away the romantic idealism that society feeds men, allowing them to understand the pragmatic evolutionary realities of intersexual dynamics.
You cannot navigate the modern dating market, Riker implies, if you still believe in Disney fairy tales.
You have to know the rules of the game if you want to survive it.
But surviving isn't enough for Riker. He wants men to transcend the game entirely. And to explain how men can break free from these crafted narratives, he introduces a concept that genuinely requires us to shift gears intellectually. He brings in the CTMU theory.
Yes, the cognitive theoretic model of the universe. This is where Riker moves from cultural critique into deep epistemology and metaphysics.
When I hit this section, I had to read it twice. It is a massive intellectual leap for a book about masculinity. But let's break this down carefully for the listener. What exactly is the CTMU, and how does he apply it?
Well, the CTMU was developed by a man named Christopher Langan. who is often cited as having one of the highest recorded IQs in America.
Okay.
Without getting bogged down in the dense mathematical logic of the theory, the core premise that Riker extracts is that reality is a self-simulating, self-referential system. Mind and reality are not entirely separate, they are mutually interactive.
Okay, so let's use an analogy here and make this concrete. Think of the CTMU like a highly advanced video game engine, but one where the code actually updates itself in real time based on the deeply held beliefs and behaviors of the player. The universe is rendering reality based on the inputs it receives from the observer.
That is a highly effective way to visualize it. Riker uses this profound theory to explain the mechanics of cultural conditioning.
How does that connect to institutional capture?
If the institutions, the media, the schools, the culture constantly feed a man the code that he is toxic, that his instincts are wrong, and that he is fundamentally an oppressor, and if that man accepts that code into his internal operating system, the universe will quite literally render a reality that reflects that degradation.
Wow.
His perception of his own worthlessness generates a reality where he behaves worthlessly.
So the cultural lies aren't just hurting men's feelings, they are actually hijacking their reality generation process. If a man believes the script that he is a bumbling fool, he manifests the life of a bumbling fool.
Exactly. Riker is arguing for ultimate, almost terrifying personal agency. Taking the red pill isn't just about being angry at feminist institutions or complaining about the double bind on a forum.
Because complaining changes nothing in a self-simulating universe.
Right. To reclaim his narrative, a man must actively, consciously rewrite his internal code. He must align his thoughts with objective, universal principles of truth and strength. If reality reflects the mind, men must build an unbreakable, sovereign mind.
You have to write a better, truer script for yourself to force the universe to render a better reality. And that realization that men are in desperate need of a flawless, uncorrupted script to align their minds with brings us to the absolute zenith of Riker's book.
The core solution.
Yes, the philosophical bedrock of his entire thesis, reclaiming Imago Dei.
This is where Riker transitions from diagnosing the disease to prescribing the cure. Imago Dei is a Latin theological term that translates to image of God. Riker's foundational argument is that the ultimate identity for men, the only identity robust enough to survive the chaotic matrix of the modern world, is the profound recognition that they are forged in the divine blueprint.
Now let's connect this to the overarching narrative we've built so far. Why does this specific concept matter so much?
It's all about where you place your worth.
Exactly. Earlier, we discussed men being zeroed out because they lost their jobs in 2008, or because they were divorced, or because the culture mocked them. Riker is attempting a massive relocation of male self-worth. He wants to move a man's value away from the external, fleeting metrics of a capitalist and highly secularized society.
Correct. The metrics of the modern world. Your bank account, your corporate title, your relationship status, the number of followers you have online, or your physical dominance, they are all fragile.
They can disappear overnight.
They can be taken away by a market crash, a corporate HR policy, an algorithm update, or just the passage of time. If your identity is anchored to those metrics, you are entirely at the mercy of the culture. You are a hostage.
He argues that tying your worth to those things reduces men to disposable cogs in a machine. But Imago Dei asserts that a man's value is inherent, unshakable, and eternal.
You don't earn it, and you can't lose it.
Right. You do not earn it by closing a massive deal, and you do not lose it if you get laid off. You possess it simply by virtue of existing as a man. It acts as an impenetrable spiritual armor against the guilt, the shaming, and the double binds we discussed earlier.
If you truly believe you are made in the image of the divine, a Gillette ad or a sitcom trope literally cannot touch you.
However, Riker makes it clear that adopting this identity is not a passive mental exercise. It requires a brutal process that he refers to as ego death. To wear the armor of Imago Dei, a man must first strip off the heavy, rusted armor of his culturally constructed ego.
And he uses a brilliant historical anecdote to illustrate this process, looking at the life of Steve Jobs.
Yes, the Apple story.
Now, most business books look at Jobs as the ultimate tech god, but Riker focuses specifically on the year 1985, when Jobs was famously ousted from Apple, the very company he founded.
Riker dissects that moment not as a corporate tragedy, but as a necessary spiritual crucible.
Prior to 1985, Jobs' identity was entirely entangled with his status as the wunderkind of Silicon Valley. His ego was immense, but it was a false self built on control, public adulation, and market dominance.
And when the board fired him, that false self was annihilated.
Exactly. Riker describes that period of exile as a descent into chaos, but it was exactly what Jobs needed. The ego death forced him to rebuild his foundation based on deeper principles of creation and vision, rather than just the desperate need for external validation.
When he eventually returned to Apple, he was a profoundly different, far more lethal and focused leader.
Riker applies this directly to the listener. You have to let the false idols of societal approval die. You have to stop caring what the culture thinks of you so your true divine identity can emerge.
This requirement for absolute internal sovereignty is exactly why Riker aims some of his harshest criticism at incel culture.
Yeah, he really doesn't hold back there.
Incel, meaning involuntarily celibate, refers to an online subculture of men who are unable to find romantic or sexual partners. Now, Riker does not lack empathy for the loneliness these men experience. He understands the brutal reality of the modern, hyper-optimized dating market that leaves many average men invisible.
Right, he acknowledges the crisis, but he utterly eviscerates the ideology.
Why?
Because incel ideology is rooted in absolute terminal victimhood, is the antithesis of agency.
They give up their power.
Exactly. Incels look at the shifting dynamics, the unrealistic standards promoted by social media, and the societal double binds, and they conclude that the game is rigged, therefore they are helpless victims. They blame women, they blame genetics, they blame society.
Riker argues that by adopting this victim mentality, they completely abdicate their personal responsibility. They surrender their reality-rendering power back to the Matrix.
Riker's philosophy dictates that complaining about the system is useless if it just ferments into bitterness. Bitterness is a poison that only destroys the vessel that holds it.
A man who is truly grounded in Imago Dei understands that his core worth is not validated by whether or not a woman swipes right on him. Because his worth is divinely secured, he is freed from desperation.
He can improve himself, pursue his purpose, and eventually engage with women from a foundation of strength and abundance, rather than resentment and scarcity.
And part of that strength involves reclaiming and redefining the very traits that society has deemed toxic. This is a deeply red-pilled aspect of his theology. Riker fiercely defends traditional masculine traits, aggression, intense competitiveness, territoriality, and stoicism.
He uses the analogy of a hammer, which I think is vital to understand.
Walk us through the hammer analogy.
Society looks at male aggression and says, that is dangerous, we must medicate it or train it out of them. Riker says, yes, it is dangerous. A hammer is dangerous. You can use a hammer to shatter a window or cave someone's skull in, but you also cannot build a house without one.
Aggression and competitiveness are not inherent evils, they are tools.
Society has vilified the tools themselves, rather than teaching young men the moral framework required to wield them.
Riker argues that a man aligned with Imago Dei uses his aggression to protect the innocent and destroy evil. He uses his competitiveness to drive innovation and build infrastructure.
He uses his stoicism not to repress his emotions, but to remain a calm, immovable anchor for his family when the world is in chaos.
These traits are divine gifts designed for leadership, and suppressing them is a betrayal of the masculine blueprint. That is a powerful paradigm shift. But theology and theory are only as good as their application.
Exactly. How do you actually do this?
Right. How does a man actually execute this in the real world? How do you live out this divine blueprint when you are exhausted, scrolling through your phone, and surrounded by a culture that wants you docile? This brings us to the final major section of our analysis: practical execution. Building brotherhood, reclaiming work, and forging a legacy.
Riker grounds this practical section by looking at the physical and mental state of the modern man, and again, the statistics are alarming. He focuses on the physical toll of a misplaced identity, citing a 2022 study by the University of West England, which found that 23% of men now experience body dysmorphia.
23%.
And to put that in perspective, that number was only 15% just a decade prior in 2010.
He attributes this massive spike to the intersection of social media algorithms and toxic gym bro culture. And there is a profound irony here that Riker points out. Men are spending billions of dollars on supplements, extreme workout programs, and even cosmetic surgeries to chase this cartoonish, chiseled superhero ideal.
But they aren't doing it to attract women.
No. Riker notes that the vast majority of women aren't actually asking for the veiny 250-pound bodybuilder look.
It is a performative dominance hierarchy. Men are competing with other men for empty status metrics in a digital race that has no finish line. Riker views this as a physical manifestation of the exact crisis we just analyzed.
Because they lack the internal armor.
Exactly. Because men lack the internal spiritual armor of Imago Dei, they're desperately trying to build external armor out of hypertrophied muscle. They're trying to look invincible because they feel entirely vulnerable.
And while a segment of men are obsessively in the gym, the broader male population is suffering from a profound crisis of passivity. Riker pulls data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics regarding how men spend their time.
The leisure data.
Yes, the average man spends roughly 5.5 hours a day on leisure activities. But of that time, only about 17 minutes are spent on actual sports or physical exercise. The vast majority of that 5.5 hours is spent in passive consumption, watching screens, playing video games, scrolling social media.
He poignantly states that we have traded hands-on skills for thumb swipes, traditional masculine hobbies that resulted in tangible creation. Things like woodworking, mechanics, hunting, agriculture are dying out.
Riker argues that traditional masculinity is inherently tied to creation and mastery of the physical world.
When men are disconnected from their bodies and the physical environment, they become pacified. They consume the digital creations of others instead of forging their own reality.
To break this cycle of isolation and digital passivity, Riker outlines his most urgent practical directive: the intentional construction of brotherhood.
The modern world has made male friendship seemingly obsolete. Men are more connected digitally than ever, yet statistically more lonely than at any point in recorded history.
Riker says men need physical spaces to bond, and he champions the reclamation of the man cave.
But he redefines the concept entirely. The stereotypical man cave is often mocked in pop culture as a dark basement where a husband hides from his wife to drink beer and watch sports. Riker elevates it to something almost sacred.
He describes the modern man cave as the equivalent of the ancient tribal campfire.
It is a necessary sanctuary, an exclusive physical space where men can drop the societal masks they are forced to wear in the corporate world, share their struggles without fear of HR repercussions or the double bind, and calibrate their reality with other grounded men.
And there is hard science to back up the necessity of this physical proximity. He cites a University of Chicago study that demonstrated how face-to-face interactions among men significantly enhance emotional well-being and lower cortisol levels in ways that digital communications simply cannot replicate.
Brotherhood, in Riker's framework, is not a luxury. It is a survival mechanism. It does not happen by accident. In the digital age, isolation is the default setting.
It takes effort.
It takes active, disciplined scheduling. It requires men to turn off their screens, meet in physical reality, engage in shared physical challenges, whether that's martial arts, building something, or just sitting around a fire, and hold each other accountable to their divine potential. A single man can be broken by the culture. A unified brotherhood cannot.
That concept of accountability naturally extends to how a man spends the majority of his waking life, his work. Riker drops a staggering number on the reader here. He notes that the average man will spend roughly 90,000 hours of his life working.
90,000 hours.
That is over 10 years of continuous, non-stop, 247 existence. Yet, despite this massive investment of life force, surveys consistently show that upwards of 70% of men feel totally disengaged, alienated, or unfulfilled by their jobs.
Riker attributes this profound alienation to the fact that men have been conditioned to chase the wrong definition of success. They are grinding through those 90,000 hours solely to acquire the superficial markers of the matrix: the corner office, the luxury car, the prestigious title.
Believing that these things will finally grant them the respect and identity they crave, but as we established with the concept of ego death, those things are hollow.
To fix this crisis of meaning, Riker borrows from Simon Sinek's famous concept, start with why, but he injects it with theology. He argues that men must align their daily labor with a divine purpose.
If you are just working to buy a nicer watch, your soul will rot during those 90,000 hours.
But if you view your work as a mechanism to honor your creator, to provide unshakable stability for your family, or to build infrastructure that serves your community, the nature of the work changes entirely.
When a man understands his foundational why, the daily grind transforms from a soul-crushing capitalist obligation into a meaningful stoic mission. He is no longer just moving spreadsheets or pouring concrete. He is executing his divine mandate to order the chaos of the world.
And to really hammer home what true success and legacy look like, Riker draws an absolutely brilliant historical comparison. He compares Elon Musk to the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius.
This is such a fascinating philosophical debate. He says, look at Elon Musk. By the metrics of the modern matrix, Musk is the apex of human achievement. He is building rockets, revolutionizing transportation, and acquiring unprecedented wealth.
His accomplishments in the material realm are undeniable.
But Riker argues that an empire of steel and silicon is ultimately perishable. Rockets rust. Companies go bankrupt. Musk's material greatness, while awe-inspiring, is vulnerable to the entropic forces of time.
Riker contrasts this with Marcus Aurelius. Aurelius was the most powerful man on the planet, commanding the Roman Empire. Yet his true, enduring legacy is not the wars he won or the borders he expanded. His legacy is a small journal of his private thoughts, meditations.
Aurelius left behind an immortal legacy of wisdom, virtue, and stoic self-mastery. Thousands of years later, men who are facing adversity are still picking up his writings to find strength.
Riker's point is that true greatness, the kind of greatness that aligns with Imago Dei, is found in the cultivation of character, not the accumulation of capital.
He reinforces this ultimate triumph of internal character over external circumstance by pointing to Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor who wrote Man's Search for Meaning.
Frankl was stripped of everything: his family, his career, his dignity, his very hair and clothes. He was plunged into the most horrific, absolute degradation imaginable in the concentration camps.
Yet, Frankl realized that the one thing his captors could never take from him was his internal freedom to choose his response to his suffering.
Frankl found profound purpose in the midst of absolute hell. Riker uses Frankl as the ultimate, undeniable proof that purpose and identity always trump circumstance.
If Frankl could maintain his humanity and his divine image in a death camp, then the modern man has absolutely no excuse to surrender his identity to a hostile corporate culture or a shifting dating market.
Greatness is not about escaping hardship. It is about how steadfastly you maintain your design image while walking through the fire.
It is a demanding, uncompromising philosophy.
It truly is.
We have covered a massive amount of ideological and philosophical ground today, so let's take a breath and summarize the journey we just went on. Conrad Riker's 2025 ebook Imago Dei serves as a highly detailed, aggressively countercultural roadmap for the men out there who are feeling lost, zeroed out, and disenfranchised in the modern world.
He urges men to ruthlessly reject the societal guilt trips and the double binds placed on them by modern institutions.
He challenges men to swallow the red pill, to fully recognize and see through the matrix of what he describes as institutionally captured narratives that specifically seek to emasculate and pacify them.
More importantly, he challenges them to replace the exhausting pursuit of fleeting external status with an impenetrable bedrock identity rooted in divine worth.
It is a profound call to take extreme personal ownership over reality, to build physical, real-world brotherhood, and to forge a legacy of resilience and character.
It is a heavy, intense, and incredibly fascinating exploration of modern masculinity.
It absolutely is. And as we wrap up our analysis of this text, I want to leave you, our listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over based on the source material we've explored today.
Riker makes a compelling case that our perceptions are shaped by our environment. So ask yourself, if our modern reality and cultural institutions are indeed as heavily shaped by crafted narratives, identity politics, and psychological conditioning as Riker argues, how much of your own daily identity, your goals, your anxieties, your core beliefs, is actually a genuine, independent choice?
And how much of it is simply a subconscious, programmable reaction to the cultural pendulum constantly swinging around you?
Something to think about.
Man, that is a profound question, and one that demands serious introspection. And exploring those exact kinds of questions is why we dive into these texts in the first place. Listen, if you want to read this source material for yourself, if you want to dig into the data he presents and make up your own mind about his conclusions, go check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to buy the ebook Imago Dei.
And be sure to follow the author at Conrad N. Riker on Substack to keep up with his ongoing commentary.
Finally, one last reminder, please like this video and subscribe to the show so you can join us for the next deep dive. Stay curious, stay critical, and we will see you next time.